Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the show, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Today with us is a journalist and an author, Mark Patinkin, who will be telling us about his latest book of journeying through Israel, West Bank, and Gaza, discussing the conflict after October 7th, but who also has had the unfortunate experience of being one of the authors blacklisted by Amazon, precisely for featuring voices speaking about October 7th, part of perhaps a latest trend that we have seen throughout the publishing industry, not only with marketplaces like Amazon, but actual publishers as well. And we'll be delving into this and what that means for pro-Israel or even neutral voices exploring the conflict. Thank you, Mark, for joining us today.
Sure, glad to be here.
Before we get into the discussion, let us talk a little bit about yourself, your background, your experiences, and what brought you to decide to cover this conflict firsthand.
Sure, I've been a journalist for a very long time, for over 40 years. And though I'm based in Rhode Island with the Providence Journal, I've spent a lot of my career covering world events in places like Africa and Asia and India. And in 1989, I spent over a month from the Berlin Wall all the way to Moscow writing about the collapse of communism. And I've gone a number of times to write about the Middle East, including in 1991 during the Intifada when I was in Gaza, as well as Israel and the West Bank. And also around that same time, I covered the war in Lebanon, the civil war in Lebanon. And more recently, when war broke out between the Israelis and Hamas, I felt that was such an important world event that I decided to go there and cover it. And I should add that I at first wrote just commentaries about it, like a lot of people did, for my newspaper and for other newspapers. But it seems like every tweet, every post on Twitter is a commentary about the Hamas-Israel war. And I felt that as a journalist, I wanted to go there as a witness. So I went there as a witness for almost a month and then developed that into a book, which I have here. It's called, let's see if we can get this. Well, it's not, there we go.
The Holy
There we go.
Land at War, yes.
Holy Land at War.
It was not me censoring it.
That's okay. I know that was
Amazon.
That's how the blurred background works here on Zoom sometimes. But yes, I recently came out with a book. I think it was the first nonfiction or journalistic book on the entire war. And it just felt like such an important issue. This conflict has shaken the world that I felt it was important to write about it, not just as a journalist in the daily newspaper, but as a book, as a first draft of history.
So let us talk about your actual journey and your actual book, and then we'll get into what happened once you decided to publish it. So once you decided to cover the conflict, what did you think you had to do to cover it fairly? And where did you start? Where was it possible for you to go? And how was it possible for you to be able to get there?
That's a good question, Irina. You know, it's always challenging for a journalist to be able to get to where you want to go in a war zone. And that entire region is a war zone. Even Israel, which seems to have a little bit of normalcy when you go there, it's a war zone. Everybody you talk to has been touched by the war. Parents have kids that are in the IDF in Gaza and others that have had to bury their children. And it seems like everybody in Israel has a October 7th story. Everybody in Israel will show you their phones, and on their phones are usually text messages that arrived in real time from friends who were hiding in secure rooms during October 7th as Hamas attacked the kibbutzim around Gaza, except those secure rooms proved not to be so secure because, as I found out, those really weren't built as safe rooms. Those were built as bomb shelters, and they don't lock. And that's one way that Hamas was able to get in and murder so many people. But as I said, I was writing about the war like so many people do and still do, just as commentaries here from my desk in Providence, Rhode Island. But I decided to travel to Israel to write about it. And my writing as a commentator had been mostly defending Israel. And I still do, but I felt as a journalist on the ground, I wanted to be a witness to both sides. And so I did end up, once I got to Israel, not just covering what was going on in Israel, but there were 2 days that I went on to the West Bank. As far as I could tell, I was the only non-Palestinian face on the West Bank. And I ultimately did get inside Gaza with the IDF, where explosions were going off so close that smoke swept over us 20 seconds later. Now, I wasn't able to go into Gaza to speak to Palestinians there because international journalists are not allowed in to Gaza except with the IDF. But I did spend a lot of time tracking down the phone numbers of certain people inside Gaza. And though the communications are disrupted, I did have many phone calls from people inside Gaza and text messages to hear the firsthand reports of what it's like there. So I was committed to covering both sides, but it was challenging, as you asked. It was challenging to be able to, I'll give you one example of how challenging it was. I arrived there on the 100th day after the conflict, and I wanted to speak to the parents of some of the hostages. And many of those parents at first said yes, but when the day came to interview them, they said it was the 100th day and they were too emotional and too drained, and they canceled because they just didn't have it in them to be able to talk about it. And those are the kind of challenges you run into, as well, as a journalist, I wanted to get inside Gaza to see what it's like. And the IDF several times said, well, tomorrow I think we could get you in there on a trip. And then they canceled and canceled and canceled because they have other things to worry about during a war besides journalists. But I ultimately was able to get inside. And I also was ultimately able to interview parents of hostages. In that case, not by setting up individual appointments, but I just one day went to Hostage Square in downtown Tel Aviv, which is where hundreds and sometimes thousands gather many times a week, because Israel is like a family and the hostages are like everyone's children. And that particular day I went there was a very emotional day because it was the first birthday of the youngest hostage. And I was able to, even though I had not appointments, as I walked around, there were thousands of people there. And as I walked around, I ran into 3 separate parents of hostages, because that's how many people are missing. That even in a crowd of thousands, if you walk around and talk to people, you end up finding the very parents, the very family members of the hostages, including I talked to the grandfather of Kafir Bibas, who was the youngest hostage. He had turned 1 that day, and he's still held hostage today. Now, I would have liked to have talked to the parents of Kafir Bibas as a journalist, because that's more immediate. But I was unable to, because the parents of Kafir Bibas are also still held as hostages right now. But I did talk to the grandfather, who tragically has had both his grandchildren and his son still held in tunnels in Gaza.
When you started out to cover this conflict, how was there a particular vision? Were there any particular points you wanted to make sure to cover? How did you've been traveling, you were setting up interviews with different people. What was the structure of what you wanted to ultimately carry over to the audiences?
Well, that's a good question. I think during a war, it's very difficult to go there and know that your plan will work. You just don't know what's going to happen each day. There were several days I tried to get into the West Bank and I couldn't. And there were several days, as I said, that I tried to get into Gaza with the military and I couldn't. So my approach was just that instead of having a prearranged idea of which chapter would come first, second, and third, that I would just write this as a journey. It would be my own journey, what happened to me every day, where I was able to go every day. Now, I did, though, have one priority, and one priority is that I wanted to try to start where the conflict started. And though I wasn't able to do that the first or the second day, by the third day, I had made an arrangement to go to ground zero, to go to the Gaza envelope, as they call it in Israel, which is the area just outside of the Gaza Strip that was attacked by Hamas on October 7th, where the kibbutzim are, where people lived in these various small villages that are called, kibbutzes, kibbutzim. And I wanted to go there and begin where the conflict started. And so I went to the site of the Nova Festival, which was the worst site of slaughter. Over 250 people were murdered there. And then I went to the worst hit kibbutz, which was called Kibbutz Be'eri, where over 100 were killed. That it was still very difficult to get into Kibbutz Be'eri because it's not wide open for any tourist to go there. It's still very tightly controlled because it's a memorial. Even more than a memorial. I'll take that back. It's not a memorial, because a memorial is a place that is cleaned up. It's left just the way it was after the attack. So I would call Kibbutz Be'eri, the worst side of the attack, not a memorial, but a testimony. It's a testimony to what happened there, and the people who live there have intentionally left it as it was, except for the removal of the bodies. You could still even see in some areas bloodstains. You could see so much destruction, so much rubble. And so that's where I began. And I will say that it still is with me the most shocking thing that strikes you when you go into a kibbutz that was so targeted. This was just a huge target of Hamas.
Mhm.
And what strikes you when you walk in there, Irina, is not just that you see that the buildings were burned down, but what strikes you is that in addition to the buildings being burned down, there was just this gratuitous effort by Hamas to destroy everything. It wasn't enough for them to burn down the buildings. They also had to destroy the entire landscape. There are concrete and masonry patios that were just destroyed and smashed, because what Hamas did, they were just set on absolute destruction. Hamas did to the villages the same thing that they did to the people. First, they murdered them, and then they mutilated them. And that's the stunning sight you see when you go into a kibbutz at ground zero. It's a mutilated place.
So I think it's fair to say that this was not merely an act of war. This was not just another time when they fire missiles or go and simply shoot at something. This was a very deliberate act that does not fit within the normal framework of wars.
No, this was gratuitous destruction. They wanted to destroy everything they could. And when you go, I was there 100 days after the attack, and it's a beautiful kibbutz. People moved there first because they thought it was safer than the city, though the cities in Israel are very safe. But they thought it was a safe place to raise their children, and they also wanted to be connected to nature. And so the kibbutz is full of flowering bushes, and you think that maybe you would have been able to smell the fragrance of these bushes, but you can't, because it's overwhelmed even 100 days later by the smell of burnt things. There was so much that was burnt there. I'll tell you how badly destroyed it was. We were walking, I was given a tour. It's very hard to get a tour. You have to apply and wait because they don't want to disrespect the dead. They don't want to disrespect the scene. So only a few people are allowed to have tours, and you have to set it up. And my tour was given by a woman named Nektar Shavit, who survived there, and her parents survived there, but many of her neighbors were murdered. She survived there hiding in her apartment, even as Hamas members knocked on her door, and she didn't answer and prayed that they would go away. She had not given a tour of her hometown, of her home village, for those 100 days because it was too traumatic. Do you know why she decided this was the first day she'd given a tour? You know why she decided to finally be among those residents of Be'eri who gave a tour? She decided to do so because the world had begun to deny that it had ever happened. They had begun to deny that October 7th had happened. And so she decided it was her duty as a survivor to start to be a witness and share the truth of this destruction with other witnesses. And as she walked us through the kibbutz arena, it was she was speaking in Hebrew, and I don't speak Hebrew. I wasn't the best student in Hebrew school when I was young, and even then it was years ago. But so I recorded her, and I was going to have it translated later by one of the translators and guides I had hired. And many of her words I couldn't understand because as we listened to the recording, we were walking through this kibbutz, and the sound of our feet walking over the rubble, the shattered, broken rubble, was so loud, it sometimes overwhelmed the ability to hear her words. That's what it's like in these villages. Everywhere you're walking through rubble.
You touched on a very interesting point, the fact that there was this denial, and quite frankly, Israel in the beginning tried to suppress the information about some of the worst of the horrors because they did not want to, I guess, traumatize the victims and the survivors even more, and for other reasons. And even the videos that started coming out from the official channels were also very carefully distributed. From your experiences, have you come across talking to people in West Bank, in Gaza, and then afterwards to the general public? Was there this sense of people feeling like the atrocities were exaggerated or that it was fabricated? Were the people outside Israel and outside, close allies of Israel familiar with what actually happened with those visuals or not?
Well, I was there,
Mm-hmm.
and I spoke to people who survived it.
Mm-hmm.
It happened. It all happened. Anyone that tries to say this was an exaggeration is wrong. And at this point, they aren't trying to downplay it anymore. If you walk through the kibbutz, you'll see big posters on some of the destroyed homes of the people who lived there who were murdered. And it has a picture of, it has their picture on big posters. And the posters actually say murdered here. So you see who lived in those houses, and it humanizes the situation. At one point, we went into the medical facility, and there was a very heartbreaking photo of a young woman nurse who had treated the wounded there and tried to hold on even after she was shot in the leg, put a tourniquet on her own leg. And finally, in the end, Hamas broke in and they shot her in the head. And I talked to other people who knew her and heard her story. There was another talk I had where it was a very difficult talk. I was near Tel Aviv with a young man who was 16 years old. He was in another kibbutz near Gaza. It was called Kibbutz Holit. And Hamas attacked his home, and he's now living with his uncle because both his parents were murdered. He survived in such a horrific way. He and his parents were trying to barricade themselves in a room, and his mother told him to go hide between the bed and the wall in the space there. And then the mother lay down on top of him. And excuse me, sometimes gets emotional. Hamas broke in and just began firing, and they killed his mother and he lay under the mother's body for a half hour while they still roamed the house and didn't see him. And that's how he survived. I spoke with him. He showed me one of the bullet wounds that went through his mother into his own stomach. And I spoke to the people who survived there. It's not exaggerated. These things all happened. I'm a witness. I'm a witness through those who survived. And that's one of the reasons I went there. Because I think the only thing, Irina, we can do in all of history's massacres, the only thing we can do for the dead is to bear witness. And that's why I went.
Once you got the impression of these horrific events that occurred, what was it that you wanted to see or understand next about it, about the situation?
Well, I think what you want to understand, is in part, I mean, you want to understand so much. One thing you just want to understand is, of course, what had happened, and that's one reason why, and Israel understands that. That's why they have left some of the areas just the way they were. If you go to Auschwitz, it's cleaned up.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to the Gaza area, it's not cleaned up. It's still a testimony rather than a memorial, as I said earlier. So it's important to be able to understand that and understand what happened. I think I also, though, wanted to understand how does a people go on after this? How is Israel able to go on? And that's one of the things that I began to explore and understand that this isn't the first war Israel's been through. This isn't the first challenge and set of tragedies Israel has faced. They've been facing these wars and tragedies and attacks from their neighbors since 1948. And so I want to understand how you cope as a country when you have that kind of history that's still going on today. The war is still going on today. And one thing that kind of interested me is when you walk around Jerusalem, even though there's a war going on, it's still a very lively place. At night, there's sidewalk cafes and the tables are full. And it's kind of a reflection of how Israel has survived. They realize that even in times of tragedy, life has to go on. And they do. Though if you talk to anyone, if you you walk down the street, I walk down Jaffa Street in Jerusalem, a very lively street with people at tables, and they seem to be having, a festive night. But if you talk to any of them and say, has the war touched you? A cloud comes over their head. Yes, the war has touched me. My son is in Gaza. My neighbor's son was killed. And they will tell you these things. But there's again, your question is, what else did I want to understand? How does a country go on who is attacked like this? I also went to the hospital where most of the Israel's IDF soldiers are treated. It's called Sheba Hospital. It's the biggest hospital in the Middle East. And I talked to one young man there. His name was Menachem Mendel, and he had been injured badly. There was an RPG that blew up right next to him. His knee was so shattered, it's questionable how easily he'll be able to walk again. His left hand doesn't work. They had to remove 8 inches of his intestine. So he's in there in recovery, and sometimes he'll sit on the patio and look down in Tel Aviv where people, he said, are bicycling and going to restaurants and going to the beach. And I said to Menachem, does that at all is that difficult for you while you're making these sacrifices to see people biking and going to restaurants and to the beach? And he said, no, it's the opposite. That's why we fight. We fight so the people of Israel can live. And that's what I want to see. That's why I made this sacrifice. So my fellow countrymen, so my country can have life go on. And so I did find that out. That was a very interesting insight into the Israeli soul and spirit. They, even in the midst of tragedy and war, life goes on in Israel because that's how it has always been.
You just mentioned something that has occurred to me a few times. a lot of the exposition of this attack has been focused, first of all, of course, on the people who were killed, and second, on the hostages, not, and their families. Not a lot has been said about the people who survived and were gravely wounded, or on the soldiers who fought and were gravely wounded but who survived, because their stories are also matter, and I feel like there's almost a limit on the scope of the impact of the conflict in Israel, because you have a finite number of the people killed and the hostages, but in fact, it was many more people who were actually affected very directly.
Yeah, that's very true. And that's a great question you ask, Irina. It's a great question. That was also one of the things I wanted to explore. It's a classic ratio in war, that there are 3 or 4 times more people injured than are killed. And so everybody keeps mentioning 1,200 people were murdered in Israel on October 7th, but thousands more were injured. And I felt it was important to try to tell that story. And in fact, when I went to interview just as it's interesting you would ask this question because it's just what came up. When I reached out to the family to interview this 16-year-old boy who I just mentioned survived under his mother's body, I contacted first the grandmother. I couldn't contact the mother because she was murdered. Couldn't contact the father because he was murdered. So I contacted the grandmother, and I said, do you think it's possible for me to interview your grandson and your other son who's now taken him in as his guardian? And I thought maybe she would say, no, it's too emotional. And she said, I'm glad you're doing that because one of the stories, just as you asked me, Irina, that's not been written about is how people have to go on with their lives who've been affected by this. All the focus has been on those that were murdered. But a big story in Israel is how are people continuing in their lives who've had so much loss? Here's a young man who lost both parents and he lost his life too. I mean, the life as he knew it, because he can't stay. The kibbutz is destroyed. He can't stay there. It's too near Gaza anyway. He's no longer as near his friends. He's in a new environment with his uncle, and he has all these losses, and yet life has to go on, and that's the case all over Israel. There's a couple 100,000 Israelis that survived, but they've been displaced because they can't live near Gaza anymore. They can't live near the northern border with Lebanon, where Hezbollah is sending rockets into Israel. So there's these hundreds of thousands of Israelis that are surviving in makeshift apartments and hotels. One person told me that his brother and his family is now in a very nice hotel in Tel Aviv. And then he said, but it sucks because they just want to be home. It's a nice hotel, but that's not what they want. And so, yes, it is a big story in Israel. How many people survived this? And in fact, when I survived, but are still dealing with ongoing trauma. And as a matter of fact, when I went to the hospital, Sheba Hospital, to interview wounded members of the IDF who were there recovering after being terribly wounded in Gaza during the conflict, I also interviewed a woman who survived in a safe room in Gaza, in a kibbutz near Gaza. And her name was Ele. She's a young doctor. She was still in the hospital 100 days later. 100 days later, she was still in the hospital because she and her husband, and they had a little daughter, and the Hamas members got outside their house and began trying to break in. And then they set the house on fire. And she and her husband were trying to shield their daughter. And then they broke into the house and they retreated into a bathroom to try to survive in there. And the Hamas members were outside jamming a pole through the window of the bathroom that was striking this woman. There was fire all around her because they threw a propane tank inside the house that was spitting fire everywhere. She was inhaling smoke. Somehow they didn't think she would survive. She was on a ventilator for a month, but she managed to survive. And she's, when you talk to her, you could see all the discolored skin from the burns. But 100 days later, she's still in the hospital. And that's as much a story. The 1,200 dead, of course, is one of the key stories of this terrible event in war. But another story is this woman named Ellie, who is one of thousands of survivors who's still coping with her wounds. So there's a very good question you asked. Yes, that's been an overlooked story, is the how many thousands, in addition to those murdered on October 7th, how many thousands were wounded, and beyond that, how many hundreds of thousands of families and others have been disrupted and lost. And, this young man I spoke to, the 16-year-old, he's one of, almost 100 orphans created that day. And there's hundreds who lost one parent.
This sort of event is a generational trauma, and one of the key issues that I think has not been understood enough in the United States, or for that matter, the rest of the world, is just how much people have become disillusioned with the idea of peace, of coexistence, after this occurred, and after a lot of the initial sentiments from the neighbors in the Middle East, from other people, were not of compassion, but of basically placing blame on Israel for allowing this to happen to begin with, and so forth. There's still people who are hoping for some sort of normalcy, normalization, and so forth, but a lot of people who were active in the peace movements and coexistence movements, they have had their entire lives upended. So what does it look like now? How are people finding their way to, what is their vision for the future, given what has occurred, and given that the state of uncertainty and the state of basically emboldened informational conflict, confrontation, not only the combat confrontation between the IDF and Hamas operatives, but this informational space, this rhetoric of hatred coming out from all these places. How are people, what are they thinking will happen? What do they think they can contribute to happening? What is the vision beyond the confines of this immediate physical kinetic confrontation?
It's not good. It's not good, Irina. It's not good. And the reason it's not good is that, most of those people I talked to, not all, but most in Israel, who used to be peaceniks, who used to be the people in favor of the two-state solution, after what happened on October 7th, now say, I don't know if we have anybody to make peace with. Almost everyone attacked on October 7th in those kibbutzim was a peacenik. The people that lived in kibbutzim right near Gaza lived there because they believed in coexistence. They wanted to be near Gaza. They wanted to be near fellow Palestinians. They hired, or be near neighbor Palestinians. They hired thousands of Palestinians, as we all know, every day to come work in their homes and in their villages. They had programs there where they would drive Palestinian friends from Gaza to hospitals in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem for treatment. They reached out to as believers in a two-state solution, as believers in peace. Almost everyone I talked to felt that way, that was affected by October 7th. They were peaceniks. As a matter of fact, the young man, again, going back to him, that 16-year-old whose parents were murdered, those parents had a pin in their house that said Palestinian lives matter. And yet Hamas came and murdered them. And so the very people that I think this has had a big impact on Israel's left-wing movement. There still obviously has to be hope for peace. You always have to have a hope for peace, and peace in some long-term form probably has to have some form of a two-state solution. But right now, that's further away than ever. Let me give you another example, Irina. There was another element of my experience in Israel in the area that's part of this book. I was there in 1991 on a very similar trip. I went to Gaza. I went to the West Bank. I went to Israel. And one day in 1991, as a journalist, I went with a 35-year-old commander of a Jeep patrol through Gaza during the Intifada of 1991. That lasted for 5 years or so. So we went on patrol. We must have been hit by a couple hundred rocks. Kids everywhere were throwing rocks. I have a photograph. It's in this book that I took through the back window. Still have the photo of a 4-year-old boy throwing a rock at our Jeep. And that commander's name, that commander of the Jeep, his name was Oded Turban. And as part of this book, I kind of went back to an account of some of my experiences in 1991, but I wanted to make it current. So I tracked down many people I interviewed in 1991, 33 years later. I found that Jeep commander a few months ago. I found Oded Turban. He's now 68. He was 35 or so, or 34 at the time. He was always, even while he was patrolling Gaza, because back then Israel did occupy Gaza, and there were Jews living there. Even back then, he told me, of course, he believed in a two-state solution, and some of his men told him, no, it'll never work. If we give Gaza back to the Palestinians, they'll attack us. And Oded Taban, my Jeep commander, who I also interviewed again a few months ago, said, no, I believe in peace. And I asked him, so how do you feel today, Oded? How do you feel today? And he said, well, you have to, at some point, there has to be peace. At some point, there has to be some kind of two-state solution. But he said, this proved to me that it probably won't happen in my lifetime, because this has set back peace so drastically. This attack, this murderous attack by Hamas, and the war that has followed it, has led to as great a divide as he has ever seen.
So let me ask you this. We've been seeing every weekend mass demonstrations in Israel. Supposedly, a portion of those demonstrations is pushing for a ceasefire deal that would have the remaining hostages released and some sort of a exchange for Hamas prisoners in Israeli prisons, and some sort of a withdrawal of Israel from Philadelphia corridor and other strategic areas. Are all these people really demonstrating for a ceasefire deal, even as some of them no longer believe in peace? Certainly don't believe in Hamas. Certainly don't believe that Hamas is in any way a truthful organization. Or is there something more complex going on with the Israeli dynamic today? Because to me, I'm perplexed by the contradictory messaging that seems to be coming out, and I'm trying to figure out what is it that Israelis actually want to see.
Well, you're right. It's very complex. I think, I was there in Hostage Square among the thousands. There are people that don't even know any hostages, though most people do. And they said they come here every day because we're family. And so a lot of it is emotional arena. This is Israel's one way to think of Israel. It's not just a country. It's truly a family. And everybody knows those that have been affected. And as we saw in the past, there were times when one person was kidnapped and Israel exchanged 1,000 prisoners for one person. And now there's 130 that are still missing, or over 100. And so it's so emotional that I think a lot of those demonstrations is just people are focused on getting their loved ones back. And they know that the only path to that is some kind of a ceasefire. Whether or not it's permanent is a question, of course, but Hamas is demanding a permanent ceasefire if there's going to be any significant exchange, is my understanding. And so the demonstrations, I think, are very emotional. It's about getting their 100 citizens back, because it's just tearing the soul of a big part of the country to have these, as in the past, when one person was kidnapped, it turned Israel upside down. Imagine what 100 have done. And originally it was 230. And so the demonstrations are about that, but they're about other things too. They're about the fact that some people feel that the war has damaged Israel reputationally around the world, and that may be true. Certainly we see that's a huge, I think, unfortunate shift in the attitude of of young people in America in particular, demonstrating on college campuses and elsewhere, and siding with Hamas. Literally, they side with Hamas over Israel. It's very demoralizing to see what's happened to the political left, to me. But a lot of people in Israel feel they're losing the war reputationally. And so there's a very deep argument going on in Israel about what's the way forward. But one reason it continues, it's not just Bibi Netanyahu who is pushing in a hawkish way to continue the war. He would be unable to do that if there wasn't an overall consensus. It's not just that there is obviously, for the most part, a consensus of continuing the war in his cabinet and in the government. They still have a consensus of support in the country to continue the war. And, I could talk about this as you and I are talking about it now, like a political analyst. But I think what I have to bring to the table is more what did I hear on the ground from everyday people? I specifically was not interested in going over there to talk to leaders. I had some connections here, and one connection said I could get you an interview with the head of the Israeli Navy. I could get you, with a high government minister. And I said, I'm not interested in that. I want to talk to a soldier in Gaza. I want to know what's on their minds in the ground. And so I could say as a political analyst that there doesn't seem to be a consensus behind stopping the war right now, despite these increasingly large demonstrations in Israel. But I will tell you that most of the people I talk to, not just peaceniks, but most of the people I talk to, such as this guy Oded Turban, who is a peacenik, and most Israelis I talk to said that as terrible as the war is, as terrible as the deaths of 40,000 Palestinians are, if that's accurate, in Gaza, as terrible as those things are, we have no choice but to continue the war until Hamas is destroyed to a point where they can't resurrect themselves. Most of the people on the ground I talked to said that, and that's where the consensus comes from in terms of why the war goes on. There's a feeling in Israel that if you stop now, this will happen again.
You mentioned the emotional element of all of this, and I wanted to touch on something that I think has been a very controversial topic. There's been this image of the Israeli soldiers who are fighting in Gaza, which has been extremely dehumanizing. You have this overwhelming imagery, and I'm not even talking about Hamas statistics for whatever they're worth or lack of, merit. I'm talking about the imagery of Gazans, women, children, whoever, being killed, being injured, civilians, and so forth. And you have this image of the soldiers that are supposedly, perpetuating this disproportional, these huge numbers that we're hearing, and this constant imagery of Gaza civilians. And this image is flooding the internet, it's flooding the Middle East for sure, and it's even flooding the images in the United States, because Israel, despite these heavy casualties, is now more or less stable. The war is not being fought in Israel, it's being fought in Gaza and now also in West Bank. So the question is, but the stories of these soldiers and what they are going through when having to deal with these civilian casualties and what psychological impact it's having on them, none of that is really making it through anywhere, not even Israeli media all that much less American or Middle Eastern. So how do we bridge this disconnect between the horrific imagery of bloodshed in Gaza and this image of human beings who are forced to put on a uniform to defend their families?
So are you asking me whether or not this has dehumanized the IDF soldiers, or what is your question?
My question is, how do we break through the dehumanization? The fact that this happened, I don't think can be argued with. If you ask this average campus activist what they think of when they think of an Israeli soldier, they'll think immediately of human rights violations and casualties, regardless of whether that is true or not.
Yeah, I mean, I was in Gaza. and I was spent time with soldiers in Gaza. I spent half a day in Gaza, and I rode in Humvees with Israeli soldiers. And I found that so war is war. That these soldiers I found were all, they were humane people, but they were in a war.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked them why, how they felt about being in the war. And they said, look, one of them was 28 or 29, and he said, my grandparents always used to tell me about the pogroms that their parents survived in Russia and places like where you were from, Irina, in Ukraine, and told me about the Holocaust. And I used to think that those kinds of pogroms were from a different era and a different place and a different time. But now it happened again. And most of the soldiers had the same line. They said, it woke me up to realize that it's still 1905 in Russia for Jews, that this was a massive pogrom. And there's still a mentality of wanting to murder Jews. So this is where I have to be to keep my family safe.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in terms of their conduct there, it's war. It's very tough. I'll be honest about something.
Mm-hmm.
As I went through Gaza, at one point we went through a neighborhood that was actually kind of a well-off neighborhood. They had big stone homes, each on about a half an acre, went for a mile. But 2/3 of those stone homes were now destroyed, just piles of rubble.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked the soldiers why there was so much destruction. And they said that because Hamas hides in the homes and shoots at us. What are we supposed to do? I went to a school that the Israelis had taken, that the IDF had taken over, and it was full of weapons. Uh, and they said that the day after, there was a Lieutenant Colonel Anshi, a man of probably 40 something who was intact, but now he's a soldier. And he said they took over the school, they secured the school, they began to use it as a base. And the next morning, they missed a shaft from a tunnel, and some Hamas terrorists came up through the tunnel shaft and killed 3 of his men within seconds. And that's kind of how it works. I think some people don't understand how the tunnels work, Irina. People think, oh, there's a long tunnel and there's an entrance at one side and an exit at the other. That's true, but that's not really the point of the tunnels. The tunnels are that they go underground they're 30, 40 feet underground. And in 15, 20 places along the tunnel, there's vertical shafts. And these shafts just pop up in houses and fields and schools and buildings. And that's how they attack. It's not just that they sneak out the end. There's 20 or 30 options where they could sneak out from just a vertical shaft of a tunnel that's hard to find. And that's what happened to 3 of his soldiers. And so he says, you're in a position here where the enemy comes out of the ground and it comes out of nowhere, and kills you and your men. And if you don't destroy where they're coming from, you won't survive. And so it really is a case when you hear about them using civilians as casualties, and people kind of think that's a cliche phrase now, but it's everywhere. Every house, every school, every mosque, every health facility is used as a shield. Now, I'll tell you this, though. When I went through Gaza, when I was in Gaza, it was so post-apocalyptic. It was so destroyed. It really got to me seeing this neighborhood. It was kind of a nice neighborhood, destroyed. And part of me thought, did Israel have to do this much damage? But you know what I thought even more?
Mm-hmm.
When you're there and you see this kind of dystopia, you can't help but think, how is it possible that Hamas doesn't return the hostages tomorrow and stop this? How is it possible that Hamas is sitting there watching their entire homeland being destroyed and tens of thousands of their countrymen being destroyed? They have the power to stop this tomorrow by returning the hostages and laying down their arms. But the mentality that there's so much destruction, when Japan finally surrendered in World War II because there was so much destruction. and they got to a point of saying, why is there any victory in continuing to fight if our homeland is to be destroyed? And you see this post-apocalyptic scene of Gaza destroyed, and Gaza really, I've been in Gaza a lot of times. They have obviously some very slum-like areas, but they had some nice areas too. The waterfront's beautiful. Um, and there's many photos you could see and video of what Gaza was like before October 7th. There are parts of it that are very nice. It's now utterly destroyed, and how Hamas could still allow the destruction to continue is mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling. As much as it is Israel, as being the one that is being vilified on campuses and in marches as a invading force that's destroying Gaza. I don't understand why there's not the mentality of saying to Hamas, how could you let this continue to your own homeland? It boggles your mind when you see it. I mean, if it was you or me, if we had started some kind of a war and we looked around and said, oh my God, 2/3 of my homeland is destroyed, I got to stop this. But they don't care. They are continuing to go on.
So that
Now,
Mhm.
well, I was just going to say, now your other part of your question is it dehumanizing Israeli soldiers? I will say there's always a danger of that. When I was in Gaza on patrol in 1991, my friend Oded Turban told me that some of the young soldiers, uh, the commanders have to watch out for young soldiers turning into, as he said it, we don't want our young soldiers to turn into monsters because people throw rocks at them every day and they yell that your mother's a whore and your sister's a whore, and and they attack you, and they want you to attack back so that they could demonstrate to the world how there is look what the Israeli patrol did. They shot my friend and will parade his body through the street now. They want you to do that. And so there is a concern among commanders of their soldiers being dehumanized by war, which has ever been the case. But it seems to be really a threat here because it's almost like the enemy wants you to kill them so they could hold up the bodies as a demonstration of how the Israeli soldiers are monsters. But, when I went there, it just really, again, as I say, I went there as just to kind of immerse among the common people, soldiers and otherwise. And I will tell you that these are your neighbors that are wearing those uniforms. These are people that work in tech. These are people that work in business. These are students who are studying, science at the university. And they're wearing the uniform for, it's been a long time for Israelis, 6, 8 months away from their day jobs. And these are just your normal neighbors. And this is what you have to do in a country that's surrounded by enemies that want to destroy you.
So that actually brings me to the second kind of part of the discussion, which is what we experience is talking to West Bank residents and to Gaza residents and those calls that you made. What were you able to get from talking to people there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been talking a lot about the Israeli side, but I think this book that I wrote, um, uh, The Holy Land at War, is I keep holding it up. Isn't that what authors are supposed to do? Even though is that backwards? So I got my camera backwards.
No, it's good. I could see the title, The Holy Land
Okay.
at War. Yeah.
Okay. It's on Amazon, but even though it was banned on Amazon.
And we'll get to that.
Yeah, we'll get to that. But we've talked a lot about the Israel side, but I was very focused, Irina, on seeing both sides. And so I spent some time in the West Bank. And when I went over to first day I went on the West Bank, I went to Bethlehem. And a lot of people might hear Bethlehem and think, oh, Bethlehem, that's kind of where Jesus was born. Isn't that right in the heart of Israel, right near the West Bank? I mean, right near the Western Wall. And no, Bethlehem is very much part of the West Bank. It's 10 miles into the West Bank, and there's 2 or 3 refugee camps, Palestinian refugee camps in Bethlehem. And I went there and wanted to experience it authentically, so I went there, not with a guide, but I arranged to meet a young man who was a teacher, so a guy in his 40s named Omar. Really nice guy, has 3 kids. and I went through this long border tunnel between Israel and the West Bank, and I was the only one there. And the border tunnel, because there's no, even though Bethlehem's a big tourist site, there's no tourists going there. The economy in Bethlehem is devastated because it's so based on tourism, and nobody's going there because it's in the West Bank during a war and during an Israeli crackdown. There's an Israeli crackdown for sure. And as soon as I emerged from the tunnel, there were 4 or 5 cab drivers who kind of came rushing around me and said, "Do you need a ride? Do you need a ride?" I said, "No, I'm sorry, I'm meeting somebody." And I said, and they said, "Well, why are you here? We don't see any Westerners come over here. You know, if anybody comes here, it's like a Palestinian." And when I'm a journalist, and right away they wanted to tell, I said, American journalist. They said, "Well, why is your country sending bombs to the Israelis to kill children in Gaza? And why is America backing Israel to crack down in the West Bank? And life here is hard. Life here is terrible. And it is very hard now because a lot of people don't know that one of Israel's done a number of things on the West Bank to try to kind of contain what they fear could be a terrorism. They've revoked hundreds of thousands of work permits. They used it mostly to laborers. The Jews aren't that good at building things. The Palestinians are really good at building things. They know how to build houses. They know how to build schools. They're good builders. They're good construction people. They're good laborers, and they had good jobs in Israel doing that. And all those permits have been revoked. So hundreds of thousands of people have lost their livelihoods. They can't come to Israel anymore. Israel's also cut off roads, as these Palestinian cab drivers told me. They've cut off roads for security reasons. And, think about this headache. They said what used to be a 20-minute drive now takes 3 or 4 hours to get through checkpoints and other points. And so I spent the day with Omar experiencing that. And the first thing he wanted to do, even though he's Muslim, he wanted to show me the Church of the Nativity, which is where Jesus was born. And he was very proud of it. And he said, "Let me take you there. But first, there was a big plaza outside between the church and the mosque. They're both kind of front of shared plaza." And he said, "This is what's happened. You see that one pigeon there? That's a symbol." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "There used to be thousands of people and thousands of pigeons here. And now there's one little pigeon because the tourism has collapsed so drastically." There's an example of how drastically it's collapsed. There was people, they could figure out if you're not a Palestinian. So this older gentleman came up to me and said, "Let me take you to my antiquity shop." I said, "Okay." And it's right next to the Church of the Nativity, one of the greatest tourist spots in the world, but his business is awful because nobody's visiting right now, despite his good location. And he showed me a lot of Christian artifacts and Christian symbols, and he even showed me some Judaica. Asked if I wanted to buy anything. I focused on this one Star of David on Jerusalem, ancient Jerusalem glass. And it cost $400. And I went, "That's kind of a lot." But my friend Omar said, "Hey, that'd be $1,500 in Jerusalem." So as somebody that's Jewish, I like a good deal. Okay. So I said, "Okay, I'll get that for, so I bought it for $400. That was 100 days after October 7th. He said that was his biggest sale in 100 days. And then Omar wanted to show me the actual chamber, the actual place where Jesus was born, the grotto, and it's very moving. And then he took me outside to an overlook because Jerusalem's kind of Bethlehem's kind of on a high hill, a few 8 or 9 miles from Jerusalem. And he looked down. He said, "What do you see?" And I said, "Well, I see a lot of old villages, and I see, oh, there's some new villages up there." And he said, "Yes, those are new Israeli settlements, and they're getting closer and closer." And then he used an Arabic word. He said, "Shway, shway." He said, "That's how the settlements are expanding around us." Shway means little bit, little bit, little bit, more and more every day, every year. And so he was a very moderate guy, but he said life is hard. It's hard for him too. He's a teacher, so that means he's under the employ of the Palestinian Authority, the government, and Israel has also withheld tax remittances to the West Bank. And so his salary has been cut in half. Then he took me to a refugee camp, and we went to a friend of his who's not untypical, and the friend said three of his sons are in Israeli prisons. just arrested recently, and he's not even sure why. He thinks some of it was for maybe some Facebook posts, but that's another problem. The law in the West Bank, all Palestinians are not under Israeli civil law, they're under military law. And so if they get arrested for even for a small thing, there is not a lot of due process. So there's people that have been in prison for months and they can't visit, they can't speak, they don't even know why. And that's been hard on him too, because he's a little bit older, and it's Palestinian culture for younger folks to support their family, and so they're not able to do that now. Nevertheless, it was great. I was very welcome there. I was very welcomed by they kept saying welcome, welcome to you, and I sat down in this home, and they came out right away and they served us the spicy chicken dish, and they were very welcoming to us. But they also were like asking why is America sending bombs to Israel to kill our children, and then I saw an interesting thing, Irina. I saw a picture of an older man on the wall by kind of an image of some land, and they said, "Who's that?" They said, "That's our patriarch. He just died recently at almost 100 years old. He used to own land near Tel Aviv, and that's the land. That's our land, and we want to go. That's the land we're waiting to go back to." And that was an insight in the Palestinian culture and mindset. They live very much in the past. And the past is all about the land they had before 1948. And even though it's 3 generations later, the refugee camps, they're still refugee camps. The United Nations still designates them as refugee camps. They look more like slum neighborhoods now because it's been 3 generations, as opposed to like tents with a fence around them. But they are they're sitting there they're happy they're not happy to be refugees, but they are saying we are refugees not by choice, but we want it this way because this will tell the world to give us back our homes. So there is a mentality even there in the West Bank and in Gaza too. If you talk to civilians there, they're waiting to go back to their homes within Israel, like 80 years, 76, 77 years later. Some of them have keys to homes that that no longer exist, really. When I was there in 1991, I stopped and talked to some kids on the street in Gaza. And I said, well, so where do you guys live? And one of them said, we live, our home's in Beersheba. I said, wait a minute, that's in Israel. And they said, yep, that's where home is. I said, what's it like there? And said, well, it's where my grandfather's had his home. And it's beautiful with oranges and green trees. I said, oh, really? When were you there? He said, oh, I've never been there. But it's my home, and that's what I want. That's what I'm waiting to go back to. And that mentality kind of continues. Finally, Omar said, would you like to see my village? And I said, sure. And so it was a long drive to his village because we had to go through some checkpoints. And at one point, Irina, we were about to go through a checkpoint, and I saw another new village, new construction. And I pointed. I said, hey, what's that over there? And he immediately grabbed my arm and pulled it down. He said, no, don't. He's a very nice guy, but he said, don't ever point when you're near a checkpoint, because we're just far enough away that an Israeli soldier, they're very jumpy, and they might think that your hand pointing is you aiming a gun, and they'll just shoot first and ask questions later. And that's the kind of situation that a lot of Palestinians are under. And so as we got through the checkpoint, we drove on to his home in this village. And, he pointed out, he said, a lot of people in my village, they're building their homes up instead of outside the village, because Israel has put a perimeter forbidding development of some Arab villages beyond the perimeter of the villages, partly because they're reserving that for potential settlements. And he would point it again and said, shway, shway. You see how they're encroaching? And it was a real insight into how difficult life is, even among moderate Palestinians like Omar on the West Bank. And yet there is a very collegial culture there, I must say. At one point at the end of the day, he dropped me off to get a bus kind of in a very kind of rundown area back to Jerusalem. And he said, I'll wait with you. I'll wait with you for the bus," because he was looking after me. And then I looked around, I said, this is the kind of area that in America you would see homeless people. And I haven't seen much of that. And he said, I know despite the poverty and deprivation here, he said, there's no homeless people in Palestinian culture. And he's right. There aren't. He says, because we look after each other. And and that's how they've gotten through. That's how they've survived. And there is that attitude that they look after each other. And if somebody's home is displaced, there are times Israel destroys homes there, either as retribution for a family member being involved in some kind of accused terror attack, or just for other reasons, to maybe reclaim land for potential settlement. And those people always have another place to stay because neighbors take them in, family takes them in. That's the Palestinian culture. But it's very difficult on the West Bank right now. And I will tell you that as an independent observer, I feel that the crackdown is too hard. The crackdown is causing a pressure cooker. There's been hundreds of deaths of people shot since October 7th on the West Bank, I think 600 or 700. On another day, I was in Ramallah, the capital. There was a teenage boy who was American, who was there visiting his culture, who was shot that day by a settler and an off-duty policeman in some kind of, misunderstanding that was just a tragedy. It was he wasn't doing nothing wrong, this young man. And I actually spent that day in Ramallah with reason I went there was an interesting case. You may recall, Irina, there was a very tragic case where 3 young Palestinian college students were shot in Burlington, Vermont, right after last
Yes.
Thanksgiving.
Mm-hmm.
And that brought the war very close to me because the worst injured of those 3 is a young man who goes to school blocks from where I live. He goes to Brown University. I live in Providence, where Brown is. And I wanted to see his background because I interviewed his uncle when I was before I went to Israel, and I thought it'd be interesting to see his actual background. And so I met his best childhood friend, who's also a Brown University student. And he's a great young man named Abu Dashab. And he showed me, where the best ice cream is in Ramallah. If you ever go to the West Bank, the best ice cream is Rukab's. Just remember that. It's great stuff. And he wanted to show me, he's real proud of Ramallah and his culture and his background. But he said, even though he's this nice young man, he said that young American visitor, it could have been me. He said, yes, just a few days ago, he said he came across a Israeli checkpoint in a place where he didn't expect. And he put on his brakes very quickly. He said if he would have braked a few seconds later, he said, I might have been shot. Then he paused and he said, I would have been shot. And his father, who's a doctor, spent time in an Israeli prison when he was younger, just for protesting the occupation.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that, it's an extraordinary story. Here he is, a young man that rose from the West Bank to go to Ivy League University, partly through a remarkable school on the West Bank called the Ramallah Friends School, and where young people dream and rise. And he was a graduate of that. And now he's back at Brown University this year. But, he showed me how it's a vibrant place. I like Ramallah. Bethlehem was very, very depressed. Ramallah is very lively, even though there's a lot of hardship there. He's very proud of that culture. But, I worry the crackdown is creating more and more more and more extremism. And when I asked my friend Omar during my day in the West Bank, at one point he said, well, we're going to go to one of the refugee camps. There's 2 or 3 refugee camps here. One is the most extreme. And I said, why is that one the most extreme? And he said, oh, they have the most martyrs. And I said, what do you mean? He said, the most fathers and brothers and sons that have been killed. And he said, that's the source of much of it here.
Mm-hmm.
When people lose a family member, they become radicalized. And that continues to happen with hundreds of people killed in Israeli raids and crackdowns, and maybe some of them would be terrorists, but it's the crackdown on the West Bank, I think, is unnecessarily hard right now and creating unnecessarily worrisome tensions.
Do you think it's contributing to the rise of Hamas in part of West Bank?
I'm sorry, one more time.
Do you think it's contributing to the rise of Hamas in parts of West Bank?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Um, but it's a complicated thing. Yes, the crackdown has led to the rise of Hamas in the West Bank. But what's complicated. The thing is, if you talk to most people in the West Bank, and if they're honest with you, they'll say most people here supported here Palestinians here, even somewhat moderate ones, not all, but many, maybe most, support October 7th. That's just the mentality there. But it gets very complicated, Irina. It's not just that they celebrate Hamas for murdering Jews, though that's a lot of it. I can't deny it. But
Mhm.
it's also that one reason Hamas rose wasn't just because it's a radicalized culture that's embracing jihadism. Hamas rose because for a very long time, the alternative, the Palestinian Authority, has been a corrupt, somewhat incompetent organization,
Mhm.
and people were looking for an alternative to that. And you know, I think a lot of people don't remember that Israel was occupying Gaza until 2005. They withdrew in 2005. In 2006, there was an election where Hamas won a majority. And people don't recall, there was a shared government in Gaza in 2006 between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. And at that point, the Palestinian Authority began to build up their security forces, frankly, with the backing of Western nations, and Hamas saw that as a coup threat, and there was an actual civil war between Palestinians, between the uh, Palestinian Authority, which even back then in 2005 was run by Mahmoud Abbas, who is now almost 90 years old and still in charge. Which there's been an election in 16 years or so, and a couple hundred were killed, and finally the Palestinian Authority withdrew from Gaza. And but one reason why people voted for Hamas at that point, it wasn't just jihadism, though that was a little bit of it, that it was because the Palestinian Authority was seen as corrupt and somewhat incompetent and hadn't delivered on some of the hopes of greater autonomy.
Mhm.
And so it's a very complicated thing. It's my feeling that if there was a much more competent and less corrupt Palestinian Authority, there wouldn't be as many people supporting Hamas. So it gets into some complicated politics as well as just a radicalization of Palestinians who are embracing jihad. It's both.
And speaking to people in Gaza that you did, what was your sense? What did they think was going to happen? What were they hoping would happen?
What did the Hamas hope would happen when they attacked on October 7th?
No, no, whoever you were talking to in Gaza, you said you were able to make some calls inside Gaza.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I couldn't get in, tried to get in, but the IDF's not letting international journalists in. And so, it took a lot of work and many days of gathering phone numbers, and phone numbers don't go through. I was calling doctors and humanitarian workers, and 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 I called and called, and finally I reached one doctor, and I was able to reach him, Marina,
Hmm.
because he wasn't actually in Gaza at the moment. He was in Istanbul, same time zone. It's like 8 or 10 at night. And I reached him. He was the head of a hospital there, but one day he was at hospital like 2 a.m. and he was told a terrible thing had happened. His family had been displaced several times, and now we had like 40 or 50 family members living in one big home, one big building, and that building took a direct hit from an Israeli strike. And that's a terrible tragedy that happened. It should have never happened. He lost dozens of family members. And so he had taken two of his grandchildren who lost their parents, young grandchildren, to Istanbul to a hospital there where he said, I now choose, instead of being a doctor who's head of a hospital in Gaza, I choose to be their mother and father because I'm all they have left. And, this is what's happened to people in Gaza. Even this good guy who was a doctor running a hospital there, many of his family members were killed in this Israeli strike, including a beautiful daughter that I read about online who um, uh, was kind of a well-known nurse there. She was even eulogized by the head of in Gaza, the head of the World Health Organization, whose name is um, uh, um, Tariq. And I mean, these are the woman that had, a great future in front of her. So I talked to him, and he said, I I don't know what my future is going to be, but there's so little left of the Gaza I knew, um, that I don't know what's going to happen there. I reached also a young man who was a spokesman for the International Red Cross. I think I was able to reach him because his job is to be available. But I talked to him person to person, not as an official. And he said he grew up there. And he even married a Filipino woman with a Filipino Palestinian background. So she and he was able to be evacuated with his young son. And she had given birth 8 months before that, and yet he chose to stay and had yet to even see his newborn son. And he said, because my work here is important, and this is where I grew up. This is where I still want to try to help my neighbors and others. And I said, have you lost many friends? He said, oh, yes. He said, yeah, I've lost one of my closest colleagues. I said, was he a good guy? He said, oh, nicest guy you'd ever want to have your morning coffee with. But he said, the place where we used to have our morning coffee just like him is gone and destroyed. The place where I studied for my studies is gone. So much has been destroyed. I said, well, once the war's over, do you hope to stay there? And he said, I don't know. I love Gaza. It's my home, but there's so little left of it. Then I reached one more person that I was associated with. And remember, I told you I was in Gaza in 1991. And one of the things I did was to go to the Save the Children office, where I crossed paths with a young woman who was 23 or so there, named Salwa. And believe it or not, 33 years later, I was able to find her again. And I found her phone number, and I tracked her down inside Gaza, and she's still working as a humanitarian worker now at age 54. That she's been displaced 5 or 6 times by the war. She's now living in dreadful conditions in a home with dozens of family members, and the women and children are in the home, and the men are in tents surrounded by sewage trenches because there's no sanitation outside. The men outside to give the women and children some privacy, but there really is no privacy. There's 15 people in a room. They hang blankets between parts of the room for some privacy. And she's still working and was able to, among the few who could communicate, because there's basically no electricity anywhere in Gaza. But her organization, which is now Care International, she works for them, has some solar power, and she's able to power up her cell phone through them. So she was able to communicate, and she told me about her life, and remember that we might have crossed paths 33 years ago briefly, and she's still committed there. And she said she loves Gaza. That I said, what if the war ends? Will you stay? And she says, I don't know. My brother used to run a cafe, and that cafe is now gone. And my other brother used to run a dental clinic. He's a dentist, and that dental clinic has been destroyed. And our homes in the north, we hear, were both destroyed. And so I don't know if there's anything to be able to stay on for. And will our children have education if their schools have been destroyed? And so the people I talk to are very, I mean, I'm not sure how easy it will be to leave Gaza, but on the other hand, even those that love Gaza say they don't really know what life will be like in a post-war Gaza.
So you had these discussions, and there's, people right now who seem to be in the mindset of, having to deal with the immediacy of the crisis, the immediacy of their own personal tragedies and economic challenges, and the impact of the conflict. Obviously, not everybody's, a political operative who's capable of fundamentally transforming society. But does anyone see any way moving forward besides being constantly, managed by these quasi or fully authoritarian forces, the Fatah, Abbas, in the West Bank and Hamas and Gaza? Is there any sort of a interest in a more pluralistic or any sort of, or at least more pragmatic or economically prudent leadership that would be more like some of the better off countries in the Middle East than what they have now?
Yeah, I mean, there's interest in it. I think people would yearn for it. Will it happen? I don't know. Here's something, the problem with hoping for that, at least in Gaza. There's something I learned during two periods of my life. I learned it in Beirut in the late 1980s, when there was a war there that was kind of driven by Hezbollah on one side and Christian extremists on the other. And I learned it, but mostly I learned it on the west side of Beirut, which was kind of run by the militias back then, that were the precursors of Hezbollah, though Hezbollah existed then. And I learned it again in Gaza. And what I learned is, even if 80 or 90% of the people want peace, if 10% of the people are extremists with guns, they can run everything.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what problem, that is now facing. You've probably seen some of the videos of people that have protested Hamas, and then Hamas members beat them on the street.
Mm-hmm.
And so when there's 10% of the people with the weapons and they're extremists, they're able to keep 90% of the population underneath them. Now in Gaza, as we saw after October 7th, there were celebrations in the street. So there are people it's a kind of a radicalized culture. But your question about whether or not people yearn for it leads to the question of, what's the solution here? Is there a long-term solution? And look, anybody that's even done a little bit of reading or thinking about this, there's a solution. The solution is that for the most part, Hamas has to be dismantled, so
Mm-hmm.
it can't rise up again and cause more war. And the solution is that they have to be mostly dismantled, and there has to be a newly empowered Palestinian Authority, even if it's flawed, that becomes the governing authority in Gaza, and that Palestinian Authority has to be backed with the means of hopefully other Middle Eastern countries with deep pockets, like Saudi Arabia, as well as America, and then there is part of that whole scenario. There has to be a more moderate Israeli government that is open to at least the beginnings of some kind of a two-state solution. That would be the ingredients. I think the ingredients are that would make sense. Will those things happen? Are those things possible? I don't know. It seems like a long shot, because Hamas still wants control,
Mm-hmm.
and in Israel, there has been mostly a right-wing government for a very long time. But those are the ingredients. Empowered, more competent Palestinian Authority takes over Gaza with the backing of Middle Eastern nations who will finance a rebuilding of the Gaza Strip, as well as a government that's able to meet the needs of the people. And Israel has to have a more moderate leadership that can begin to be open to some kind of steps towards two-state solution, or at least something in that direction, some more moderate approach, maybe with some curtailment of the expansion of the settlements. I'm not saying there shouldn't be any settlements. I know that they're called illegal, but as the settlers will say, there's 2 million Arabs in Israel. Shouldn't there be what's so bad about having 500,000 Israelis, Jews in the West Bank? And they have a point, but
Mm-hmm.
there has to be some limit.
I mean, it's clear to me that a lot of this is very much an issue of A, corruption, and B, ideology. If you have corrupt entities stealing humanitarian aid and repurposing it towards terrorism, and it wasn't just Hamas, it was also elements of PA who were involved in that, it's never
Yes.
going to lead to coexistence. And unless you have some sort of an educational system that absolutely puts violence off limits, I don't really see how it's going to stand. You need a leadership who is not going to be living in the past and selling fairy tales about going back to 1947, to pre-war situation in Israel. With it's just not going to happen. There needs to be some sort of a forward vision, and not just this corrupt entity that lives on redirecting people towards something that's not achievable. I just
I
don't
agree.
I
I
don't
agree
really
with
see
that.
how it's going to be possible otherwise. So, whatever the current elements are in PA or in Hamas, you can't have them running the show, because then it's never going to change.
That's correct. They look backwards and, it will never happen. They say we want the right of return to basically the land the families may have had or claimed to have had in Israel before 1948. That will never happen. And as long as they demand that and teach the next generation that they have to fight for that, there will never be peace, and certainly never a two-state solution. So the question is, will there be like an Anwar Sadat, the leader that led Israel to peace with Israel, that might emerge as a Palestinian leader and succeed? That might be one of the greatest hopes, but we haven't really seen any signs of that. I remember talking to a man named Adnan Husseini in 1991, who was a architect and a member of the Palestinian Authority, who was very, very clear-eyed. He said, yes, there's settlements nearby, and I don't like it, but they're here. Let them stay. Let's try to move forward together, and let's try to move forward peacefully. And I said, what about the extremist elements that just want to push Israel into the sea? Really, he said, give us a government that's decent, and we'll handle our own problems.
Mm-hmm.
So there are voices like that, and I tried to find him again in 2024, and he's still there. He's still a prominent Palestinian elder statesman who I think is retired. Uh, and I found his phone number and I sent him texts, but he didn't respond because I think things are so controversial now. He just didn't want to stick his head out because it's actually a little dangerous to speak as a moderate right now in the West Bank or in certainly in Gaza.
So this leads me to the question that your book obviously features the human voices from very different perspectives. But I think it's a very fair take on what's going on from a position from someone from outside the region. And the question is, why was Amazon so why did it treat it as some sort of vicious propaganda as opposed to a fair look on human stories?
I
What did
couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. This is like, I couldn't believe that Amazon blocked my book. My book was ready to be published, and all of a sudden on Amazon, it said blocked. And basically, they banned it. They said, you violated our content guidelines, which is ridiculous because, it's just mainstream journalism. It's if they're blocking my book, they need to, that means most of the articles that have been written in mainstream publications about the war are somehow a violation of guidelines. And so the only thing I could figure, because it's a black box and you don't know the reason, they never told me the reason,
Mhm.
is that I think there was some biased gatekeeper, some like Amazon low-level employee whose job is to like review books and make sure they don't truly have objectionable material like uh, supporting rape or child abuse or something like that. And but in this case, I'm convinced, I don't know because they never told me, that it was some biased gatekeeper who saw this was a book about the war, and even though it's balanced, just felt, oh, it has the Israeli side, and we don't want that to be published. And it happened to another book written by an Israeli author about October 7th. It was basically testimonies of survivors. And both those books were just blocked, and we appealed 5 or 6 times each, and they both said, without any explanation, we reiterate our book ban, or they called it our book rejection because you violated our content guidelines. They never told us what was the violation, and so all I could feel is it was a biased gatekeeper, and that in general, probably Amazon said, "Well, be careful of books about the war because it's very controversial."
Mhm.
Uh, on the other hand, they let through 4 or 5 books that were from the Gaza perspective. They had a book called An Islamic View of Genocide in Gaza, and other books that were comparable, and those got through. And there were a couple books that did get through. There's an upcoming book by a Fox News correspondent about October 7th that got through, but it's bizarre that two books got through. And two books, I'm sorry, were banned that both included. My book has both sides, but included the Israeli side. And so, I think that that's a flawed system where if there's some person that is biased within the ranks of Amazon, they could just ban a book and they don't really tell you anything. And so when you appeal, you're not even able to appeal to a higher level reviewer. They just probably send it back to the same person. And in both our cases, our books finally were released after there was news coverage of our bans, and it led to a little social media outcry, and then our books were suddenly released. And so it's a kind of a danger of the system where you have just low-level employees who could just use their personal bias to block a book on a subject like on this controversial subject. And I'm convinced that's what happened.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because Jeff Bezos himself, if you look at his political history, has had some connections with Muslim Brotherhood activists and has very much been openly sympathetic to the other side of this whole situation, not specifically on this conflict, but overall and in general.
I'm sorry, who was that you referred to?
Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon.
Oh, Jeff. Yeah, I don't know if it comes down from him. I
No,
think it's
but it creates a certain type of culture internally. I
yeah, I
don't think
think
he reviews every book that comes to Amazon, obviously,
right.
but I do
And
think
then
that the way a company is structured very much reflects
he
the
raises those questions. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say Bezos himself was in any way, even some kind of culture that he inculcated was involved here. But I do think that there was, at some higher level, a general red flag telling the Amazon's book gatekeepers to
Mhm.
be careful of books about the war because it's so controversial, and that kind of gave cover for some biased gatekeepers to stop at least two books that were about the war that include the Israeli side. And there's no other explanation I could come up with because it was just, there's nothing in this book that violates their content guidelines. And it's just a mainstream book. In the past, I was a Pulitzer finalist for international reporting. Same kind of reporting in here. Just mainstream reporting on the ground. And so it makes no sense to ban that book. It was unbelievable that they did it. And I think it has to do with some bias of being allowed within the culture of Amazon, especially in this one area. And there's this area, they don't let you talk to the people that make the decision. So you're kind of out of luck in terms of trying to challenge your ban.
So interestingly enough, this has been also the entire publishing industry, not just marketplaces like Amazon, have had a lot of pushback against, authors they deem too pro-Zionist, quote unquote. So the question is, what does it say when entire industries get infiltrated either with moral coverage or with people who are openly hostile to that sort of free discourse and or who have political bias of some sort? How can the how can authors get through to audiences if mainstream gatekeepers are operating in an untransparent way and in a biased and hostile way?
Well, it's very hard if you're trying to go through a publisher that feels this is a hot potato, this is too controversial to touch it. But Amazon, the upside of Amazon is it's now made self-publishing a mainstream thing. And this, I decided to self-publish this book because real publishers believe you're a writer and you've been involved in publishing. You know how that works. It takes them a damn year to get a book out. So I self-published this because otherwise this book wouldn't have been out for another 8 or 9 months, and it's too current. And so there's always the option. You can now self-publish a book and get it out that way. But that's why Amazon is ban of my book is dangerous. If because they control the market. They control the public square. 50, 60, 70% of all books are sold by Amazon. 90% of ebooks are sold by Amazon. They control the public square of books. If they ban your book, that is 1,000 times worse than some group banning a book from a local library. So they really should be held more accountable about blocking books, because that's a real ban. You know, we always reading about, oh, there's some extreme group in Kentucky or Ohio that banned a book from a library because they felt it was inappropriate for children. And that's kind of a ban, but this book's still everywhere. When Amazon bans your book's nowhere, man. I mean, you could publish it maybe through, some other small places, but Amazon owns the book market. So that's the danger is if they ban you, they're able to really ban a book. That's a real book ban.
So would you say that Amazon, by acquiring such a big share of the market, runs into danger of becoming a monopoly and violating antitrust laws in the US?
Oh, they're a monopoly, Irina. They're a book monopoly. As I just pointed out, they have sell 50% of print books and 80, 90% of ebooks. They're a monopoly already. And so that really, I would just say they need to be careful about cases like this, even if there are not a lot of cases like this. They got to be careful, because if they start getting a reputation for banning books for political reasons, that could bring a lot of attention upon them as abusing their power as a monopoly.
Mm-hmm. That's my sense exactly. I think if this continues, they will probably run into some litigation and investigations and challenges of that sort, because I just don't see how anyone can do that without a pushback for it too much.
Yeah. And I mean, it's not universal. Like I say, there have been other books that have gotten through. There's an upcoming book by a Fox News correspondent about October 7th called Black Saturday that's going to be published in a month. And that seemed to get through. So it's not universal, but as I say, individual gatekeepers, who knows, maybe it was just some 28-year-old person that some millennial who goes to campus protests and doesn't like Israel and saw a book that seemed to have the Israeli perspective in there somewhere, or just was generally about the war, even though it has both sides, and said, I'm not going to let this through. And their structure doesn't allow appeals up the chain. And that's what was frustrating for me. I went through a whole week where I thought it's over. I'm not going to get my book out.
That's
And
terrible, and I'm very glad that you've been able to get it out. Have you been able to get, a lot of different people to engage about it?
some, as you saw, there was an article that I wrote myself that was in the New York Post, and that I will tell you that it's getting a self-published book, attention to a self. This one, I'm grateful to you for talking with me, but it's very hard to get attention to a self-published book.
Mm-hmm.
And even though this book is about a prominent, I'm a longtime journalist with a long experience and record of writing about global events. And as I mentioned, I was a Pulitzer finalist in international reporting. But still, the structure out there is all the attention is usually given to the books that Random House published or Simon and Schuster published, and so it's hard to get attention for the book. So if you could just please tell the New York Times to review my book, I'll be very grateful.
Will do. To the best of my ability, but for sure, I hope that my audience viewing this video will be encouraged to read the book, to reach out to you as well, to recommend it to other people. It may take a little while. I'm a bit backlogged, which is a good problem to have, as far as I see, but
Well, I
unfortunately.
appreciate it. And look, it makes it, I've found one thing in book publishing. Every single book sold makes a difference in keeping it a little higher on radar.
Mhm.
And so if any of your listeners are nice enough to buy the Holy Land at War, Holy Land at War, you go on Amazon and find the Holy Land at War. Even one purchase, 2, 3 books sold would make a little difference in keeping it up on radar. And so I'm grateful for every book buyer and every reader.
Thank you
And
so much.
if you sell 10 books through your show, I'll send you a set of steak knives, okay?
Well, thank you so much. And I hope, by the way, that you will continue writing this sort of kind of honest journalism, this fair journalism, and this very human perspective that I think we need a lot of, because we've been hearing too much of, Hamas affiliated stringers about this affiliated and not enough of everyone else.
Well, thank you for that. Are you going to buy it?
Yes, I will.
Okay, Irina. There will be a quiz next week.
I will get myself ready. Thank you so much. And for everyone watching this program, this was the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Please check out the Holy Land at War, and please circle back to us next week, Tuesday night at 9 p.m. We will continue with our programming as usual. Thank you, and have a great evening.
Thank you, Irina.